Hello students of history, and welcome to this quick tutorial on History Writing 101, how to write a thesis-driven essay. Today I'm going to be giving you some general tips on how to write a solid essay for your next history topic. So the most important thing to take from this video today is every history essay must have a thesis, and that thesis must be defended. Now the best way to defend that thesis is to have facts, to have evidence, to have analysis, all things that you can find through the study that you'll be doing in your course. All right, and so some basic components of a history essay. First of all, style. The next thing to consider is structure. And finally, your argument and your analysis. We'll start with style. As far as style goes, there's nothing that I find more annoying than students who use personal pronouns throughout their essay. Incredibly annoying for just about any history teacher out there. So avoid things like I think, I believe, or I feel. All right, so here's an example. By the late 1950s, I think that there was a growing restlessness that was bubbling beneath the apparently placid surface of American society. This is why I believe that if we look at that restlessness, we can see how it could make the 1960s one of the most turbulent and divisive eras of the 20th century, in my opinion anyway. All right, this is pretty ugly because all of these words that you see in red are all examples of using personal pronouns, and it thus makes the essay weak, makes that statement incredibly weak. The best thing you can do is remove the red. All right, so get rid of those personal pronouns and it's a much stronger statement. By the late 1950s, there was a growing restlessness that was bubbling beneath the apparently placid surface of American society. Ultimately, that restlessness would make the 1960s one of the most turbulent and divisive eras of the 20th century. Excellent. The next major thing to look at is structure. When you're looking at the structure of writing an essay, some things to consider as you're thinking, how do I write this thing? Well, first of all, you should always outline your essay. No matter if you have 2 minutes to plan your essay for a midterm exam, for instance, or if you're writing an essay outside of class and you've got days in which to plan it, you always need to outline it. That gives you guidance. That helps you to plan, all right, first of all, what is the thesis? Then you'll have always at least 3 supporting arguments and then specific evidence. And after completing your outline, you need to prepare an introductory paragraph. This is the kind of thing that sets the stage or the historical context. So you should be discussing this is the era at large. And another thing to do is to consider that your audience is looking for something interesting. All right, for instance, if you're writing for your professor or your teacher, make sure that you hook your teacher because they are like a reader fish swimming in a sea of boredom. And if you can't find a way to hook your audience and intrigue them right away in the introductory paragraph, then you will lose them and therefore your grade will not be as stellar. And then at the end of your introductory paragraph, you must have a thesis. All right, now the thesis is not saying, I today am going to talk about. No, your thesis is your argument. For a history paper, you must have an argument and you must defend that argument. So this argument should be based on the prompt or the question that's been provided to you, and it must be something that is provable within the given context of that paper. So if you've got a 5-paragraph essay that you're writing, your thesis should not be something so broad that it would require an entire book to write. It must be narrow, it must be provable, and within a given amount of time in your paper. All right, so the next thing to consider too is the evidence to prove your thesis. Those are your main points, and at least have 3, and then support those with evidence. Within your main points, it's always important to define important terms. For instance, if we throw in terms like humanism, republicanism, absolutism, or fascism, those should be defined within the essay. All right, another thing to include in the main points in the body of your essay would be names, dates, events, important fact figures, you name it. You should also include specific source citations, and these should always be ones that are included in your class discussion, but also if you decide to do additional research outside of class, certainly include those as well. But make sure to cite those sources, both primary sources and secondary sources. And then you should have every statement going to do something. It should prove your thesis. Don't waste your reader's time by having one good point in a paragraph and the rest of the paragraph being boring humdrum to make it look like you're filling pages. So finally, in your essay, you need to have a conclusion. Your conclusion should be a quick summary, and it relates back to your thesis. All right, now the argument and analysis portion of your essay. Things to remember here, a quick acronym, T. All right, so your T stands for thesis, evidence, and analysis, also known as your argument. All right, so the most important thing is that thesis. The thesis is what guides the entire essay, guides the entire paper. Without a thesis, your essay or paper will be like a rudderless ship lost in a sea of ignorance. Don't let that be you. So here's how we formulate a thesis, which is arguably the hardest part of writing a history essay. First, you want to look at the prompt or the question. All right, so you always want to read this carefully, and then something you should do is look for the task words, chronology, and scope of this prompt. So first of all, the task words. All right, so task words could include things like analyze, describe, compare and contrast, or evaluate. All right, so if we look at some examples down below, we see analyze the major factors responsible for the rise of anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe, analyze the ways in which the events of the French Revolution and Napoleonic period led people to challenge Enlightenment views of society, politics, and human nature. Compare and contrast the relationship between the artist and society in the Renaissance or Reformation period to the relationship between the artist and society in the late 19th century. And then finally, our last example, describe and analyze the changes that led to Europe's rapid population growth in the 18th century. So these are prompts that could be very difficult if you don't know what you're talking about or if you don't pay attention to what's being asked. So first of all, the task word, analyze, compare and contrast, describe and analyze. All right, next, chronology, time periods are important to pay attention to. So for the first prompt, if we're looking at the rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, it would be a complete error for you to write about the Nazis because they are the 20th century. It would be a complete error for you to talk about the Holocaust since it is the 20th century. You must pay attention to the time period and chronology. Otherwise, you could go totally astray with your essay. So then finally, scope. Make sure that you answer everything with evidence. So when you formulate your thesis and write your essay, be sure that the entire essay and your thesis cover the entire scope of the essay. Whatever's being asked in the prompt must be covered by your essay and your thesis. Otherwise, you will lose your reader and therefore lose your grade. So some thesis examples. Here we've got a prompt. Analyze the influence of humanism on the visual arts in the Italian Renaissance. Use at least 3 specific words to support your analysis. Okay, good enough. So as long as you know what you're talking about, you should be able to answer that. Well, here's an example of a thesis. The Italian Renaissance saw many changes in the role of the artist, the techniques of the artist, and the subject matter of the artist. This is wrong. This is a poor thesis because this does not actually address the prompt itself, because it does not include anything about humanism and the role of humanism on the visual arts. Here's another example. Same prompt, different thesis. Humanism influenced the arts in the Renaissance. Okay, well, it's too simple. The problem with this one is it's no good because it is too simple. It does not specifically reference 3 specific works, nor does it reference the influence of humanism on the visual arts. All right, here's one that's a little bit better maybe. The humanist movement impacted the subject matter and themes of the art of the time period. All right, a little bit better. It's fair, we could say, because it's simple and it has a split. So the thesis has what we call a partition, meaning that the subject matter and themes are the 2 different parts of the essay that are going to be addressed, but it lacks explanation or general analysis of these areas. Now you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, well, I'm starting to get lost here. Well, if we take a look at this final example, you can see the effect of the humanist movement on the visual arts is seen in Renaissance art's emphasis on the study of the human form, incorporation of more secular themes, and the return to the principles of Greco-Roman culture. This is complex and it's split. It is solid, therefore, because it directly addresses the question. The first part of it somewhat summarizes the prompt, and then the next part of the partition directly addresses things with those 3 different parts that are being used for analysis. And finally, it provides a general description of what the analysis will cover. All right, now as you're forming these theses, you might be looking at that and be thinking, I could never write a thesis like that in under 5 minutes during my midterm, or even if I spent days, good luck trying to figure out a thesis like that. Well, I have what we call a last-ditch thesis scenario. All right, when you have a last-ditch thesis, when in doubt, cover the 3 major aspects of history: social, political, and economic. So for instance, new prompt, and this one about American history. This one says, analyze the development of Jim Crow in the South in the 19th century. Well, here is a thesis. It says, the development and implementation of Jim Crow in the South in the years following the Civil War and Reconstruction can be attributed to white fears of disruption of social hierarchy, political opportunism by white supremacist redeemers, and insecurity brought on by economic depression and competition for unskilled labor. we see in the first clause of this thesis, there is a quick overview of what the prompt is asking, and then the partition covers the rest. So we have a three-part partition, color-coded for you here. So we see that it is complex because the green stuff, that's your social, the red stuff, that's your political, and the pink stuff is your economic. All right, so again, social, political, economic, and then provide a little bit of a general overview throughout the rest of the thesis that says what each of those entail. So another thing that you need to include here is evidence. We've covered thesis, now evidence. Now when you're looking at evidence, remember that your audience is going to read, let's say you've got a teacher who's got 30 essays to grade, and those 30 essays are all saying the same thing. You can bet the person at the top of the pile is probably going to do better than the bottom essays, because those people he's already heard or she's already heard over and over again, talking about people like the Ninja Turtle artists or Martin Luther King Jr. All right, those are great people to talk about, mind you, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's better to discuss things that maybe the reader would not have expected, or to discuss different elements of history or different figures in history that maybe would not have gotten as much attention. And so write with enthusiasm and prove your point well. Good way to prove your point well, using evidence with quotes. All right, so when you're doing quotes, it depends on the length of the essay. For a shorter essay, you should only use a few words or maybe 1 to 2 sentences. Or if you have a longer essay, you could do a block quote. But again, if you're writing this thing, for instance, for an AP exam or a midterm essay, you may not have notes in front of you to give you those full quotes. So try and go into an essay remembering a few word quotes, short quotes, like "History will remember me, for I intend to write it." Winston Churchill. It's a good one to remember. All right, another one is to paraphrase. Easy to paraphrase a source, but make sure that you name drop that source. Say who said it. So in the Handbook of the Courtier, Baldassare Castiglione said, and then give a quick description of what Baldassare Castiglione had to say. All right, C. Van Woodward attributes the changes taking place in the South to, and then give a description of what he said based on your reading. In his autobiography, Malcolm X described his youth as, etc., based on your research of Malcolm X. But by name dropping, you sound more authoritative and your evidence is stronger. Now, when you're looking at analysis, be sure to use a combination of inductive and deductive reasoning. René Descartes gives us some ideas on this one. Inductive reasoning is drawing conclusions from the evidence. So, after having studied the topic and walked in to write your essay, for your history class, make sure that you include things that you've studied up to that point in your textbook or in your class discussions. And then, if you've got time to do it, use a little deductive reasoning. Find some additional evidence that helps support your conclusions that you've drawn based on your class discussions, your reading, etc. And then finally, some questions to answer in your essay. Don't actually write these in your essay, mind you, but consider this as you're writing it. What is the historical impact of what you're writing about? What do the events, historical personalities, and sources reveal about this historical impact? Does your thesis prove anything? Most important thing, you must prove something with your thesis. You must have an argument and then defend that thesis and your argument. Finally, the concluding paragraph. Now, the concluding paragraph should start with some kind of concluding phrase, such as "in conclusion" or "to summarize." You should always try to restate your thesis, but maybe word it a little bit differently just to drive the point home a little better. And finally, put your essay into the larger historical perspective. So how are all of your arguments and evidence reflective of the time period and events? Essentially, why did I waste my time reading this unless you're going to prove something? Make sure to prove it. And does this topic end some kind of movement or time period or idea? What does it all mean, essentially? Bring it all to a conclusion on what does this all mean and why is it important? Is it the beginning of some movement, time period, or idea? Something that you always want to avoid, though, is say, this is how we are here today. This is the reason that America is the way it is today, because of this thing that happened in the 19th century. Please don't do that. All right, history teachers hate it because that's what we call a slippery slope. It leads us on a very quick conclusion that may not actually be true. So those are the ways, the quick and dirty ways in which to write yourself an essay and do well with it. Of course, going into your essay, you have to have some background knowledge and have studied the topic. So this is just to add to what you've already learned. Thanks for watching.